This video is sponsored by Surfshark VPN. Click the link in the description to get 83% off for 2 years plus 3 months for free. I wouldn't describe myself as afraid of bugs. That said, there are some that do really creep me out. I'm not talking about the ones that people tend to really hate, like spiders, I think in part because they're just little guys who kind of do their own thing. The kinds of bugs that do creep me out, though, are the ones that are never alone. I think a big part of this comes from the fact that I've had bed bugs, which will absolutely do something to you. As a side note, when I had them, my roommate at the time not only didn't take any precautions, they threw a house party and then got mad at me for telling people that there were bed bugs in the apartment. I don't have a joke here, I'm just still furious. That's literally a war crime. And this is kind of weird, but there's just something about seeing comment sections like these that are just filled with bots that are unnerving in the same way that, like, this video is. Maybe I'm completely alone here, but I think that anyone who's ever had an infestation of something will kind of know what I mean here. The thing that creeps me out about spam is how it kind of feels like the same thing, this parasitic hive mind that gathers in massive numbers anywhere humans spend time. And so, for this video, I decided to learn about what spam is, how it works, and first of all, why is it called spam? The answer to that one is kind of wild. So while now we tend to think of spam as having a commercial character to it, originally it just meant being a nuisance online. As for the name spam, that came from this Monty Python sketch.
I don't like spam! Spam, 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 spam.
As one poster from that time put it.
The etymology of the term, as it was used in those days, had to do with the behavior of people on primitive, real-time chat systems, the predecessors of MUDs. A lot of people who didn't have a clue what to do to create conversation would just type in their favorite song lyrics, or in the case of people at tech schools like RPI, recite entire Monty Python routines verbatim. A particular favorite was the spam, 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 spamdy spam one, because people could just type it in and use the up arrow key to repeat it. Hence, spamming was flooding a chat room with that sort of clutter.
Just think about that. The origin of the term is a random Monty Python sketch that nerds felt like repeating. Only sheer luck separates us from a world where boner pill ads get sent to our dead parrot folder. This wasn't just nerds feeling awkward, though. Back in the very early days of the internet, if you were in a chat room, you couldn't scroll up. Once a message was off screen, it was just gone forever. And so, posting the word spam over and over again became an effective way for trolls to force out anyone they didn't like in the chat. What's kind of interesting too is the way that that sketch mirrors how spam functioned in those chat rooms. In the sketch, the word spam increasingly appears in every item on the menu, eventually forcing out all the other words.
Egg, bacon and spam? Egg, bacon, sausage and spam? Spam, bacon, sausage and spam? Spam, egg, spam, spam, bacon and spam?
Which is exactly what it was doing in those chat rooms. Words being used as objects to spatially push out any other words. But spam has become so much more than that. It's notoriously difficult to define, and that's kind of by design. In those chat rooms, for instance, if they just banned the use of the spam song, that wouldn't stop the spammers. They just switch to posting something different, and the rest of us would just lose a thing to post. Spam, as a rule, tends to operate in the gray area between what a system or platform is supposed to be used for and what it technically lets you get away with doing. I'm not sure if we'll come to a satisfying definition in this video, but we'll see. First, though, allow me to take you through the very strange history of spam on the internet. Hey, so... Oh my god, no! Not allowed there. I swear to God. Spider? No. I just adopted two very mischievous kittens, and doing this in the same room as them was a very bad idea. This is Chicken, and that was Spider. So, I say this fully aware of the irony of doing this on a video about spam, but this video is sponsored by Surfshark VPN. Now, in this video, I'm going to be talking about spam, and we'll absolutely touch on whether or not this right here counts as spam or not towards the end of the video. I'll also be going into all sorts of the unsavory people who want to mess with you online, from botnets to scammers to your ISP. That's right, I'm coming for you, Rogers! I want to be very clear that using a VPN won't solve any of these problems, but we could all probably be better about shrinking our digital footprints, and a VPN can absolutely help with that. We're also going to learn a lot about spam filters, and speaking of, Surfshark has a great one. Their clean web mode does a great job of blocking ads, pop-ups, and trackers, which might soon become extra important since Google Chrome's newly announced update may break existing ad blocking extensions. Finally, this is gonna blow your mind, but you can actually use Surfshark to change your location and watch region-locked content. I know, right? It's wild that no one ever talks about that feature. And right now, Surfshark is offering viewers of this channel 83% off for 2 years, plus an additional 3 months for free. So hit that link in the description or go to surfshark.deals/we'reinhell and use the promo code we'reinhell, all one word, no apostrophe, at checkout to get Surfshark and support this channel and my 2 demon children a little bit while you're at it. Yeah, time to start pulling your weight. You gotta help daddy sell some Surfshark subscriptions. Now, you might expect me to begin by talking about the early internet, but instead, we're actually going to go back further to the early internets. While it would be a while before we got the internet, computers being networked together was nothing new. The thing is that early computers would each have a set purpose and an operating system made for doing just that one thing. While these computers could be linked together, they couldn't talk to computers with different operating systems for different purposes. And so we got a ton of very specific networks. There was an internet linking the computers that handled aero travel, large parts of which were used to make the internet. There was another one for the computers that controlled electrical grids, and another for the computers that ran America's Cold War missile defense systems called the Semi-Automatic Ground Environment, or SAGE. Also, something I love is that the SAGE computers all came with an ashtray built into their console. This is what they took from us. Then there were internets that were a lot closer to what we think of today. There was an internet made up of computer hobbyists who made their own networks, similar to how, before major phone companies moved in, farmers in remote areas used to build their own telephone networks out of like wire, Coke bottles, and just whatever they had. There were also student-made networks like Community Memory at Berkeley, where in the back of a record store, some students rigged together a computer with a couple old banking machines, a keyboard, and then, instead of an electronic monitor, a roll of paper and a printer behind a plastic screen, creating the first ever electronic bulletin board. So, community memory and other early student internets were made possible by the move from batch processing to time sharing. Originally, computers were used on sort of a first-come, first-served basis, where one person would use it, spend hours manually entering in a program, then let the computer run it for hours before it would become available to the next person. This was wildly inefficient, and so as computers became better, colleges and universities moved to time sharing, where lots of people would all use the computer at the same time and share its processing power. This was, among other things, much more efficient, since one person couldn't make full use of a computer, but a group could. This led to much more robust networks used by researchers at several colleges and universities across America to collaborate. The two biggest of these were the Compatible Time-Sharing System, or CTSS, at MIT, and Project Genie at Berkeley. both of which caught the attention of Room 3D200 at the Pentagon. Room 3D200 was the office for the Advanced Research Projects Agency, or ARPA, which would later be renamed DARPA for Defensive Advanced Research Projects Agency, for the explicitly stated purpose of making the research for this video more confusing. The office was shared by a man named Robert Taylor and 3 massive servers, giving him access to CTSS, Project Genie, and SAGE. Taylor was frustrated. Not by the fact that he, a man in his 30s, had left NASA to monitor what college students were doing on the internet, little sus, not gonna lie, but instead he was frustrated because of the redundancy of having 3 servers that couldn't talk to each other. You see, Taylor loved the fact that time-sharing and networking of computers had created a culture of collaboration, saying,
"As soon as the time-sharing system became usable at a university, these people began to know one another, share a lot of information, and ask of one another, how do I use this? Where do I find that?" It was really phenomenal to see this computer become a medium that simulated the formation of a human community.
It's so sweet seeing people from back then talk about how wonderful the internet could be for community building. You just want to go back in time and tell them about the mutual support and lifelong friendships being built on your average wiki catalog for foot fetishists. Shout out to Pug Ugly 2007. You're a real one. So Taylor figured that if these relatively small networks were already having this huge of an effect, imagine what an even bigger network of networks could do. Taylor's dream was to create
A critical mass of talent by allowing geographically separated people to work effectively in interactions with the system.
And so Taylor, who didn't have any computer science experience himself, began working with 2 other people at ARPA. Get ready for these names. J.C.R. Licklider and Johnny Appleseed. These are 2 of the most important people in the creation of the internet, and they sound like the main characters from a series of American short stories written in the 1800s about a precocious con artist kid and his best friend, a 500-year-old Dutch gnome. Licklider especially wrote a lot about his vision of the internet as a community, an optimistic view that was extremely prevalent throughout the creation of the early internet. I think a telling example of this was the early network operating system Mutix that included the command who, which would return a list of the names and phone numbers of everyone logged onto the network. As the software engineer Tom Van Vleck wrote,
"The who command contains the tacit assumption that the users of the Multics installation are all reasonable colleagues with some shared set of values."
We can see this even more so when Taylor's dream became a reality with the joining of those 3 servers into the first network of networks, Arpanet. Before I explain what Arpanet was like, let's talk for a second about how microchips are made. Semiconductor chips, the chips that regulate the flow of electricity and electronics, are extremely sensitive to external contamination, and so parts of their assembly have to be done in what's called a clean room. You've probably seen videos of this before, big white sci-fi looking rooms where everyone has to wear those outfits that are like a cross between medical scrubs and hazmat suits. The purity of the air is measured in microns of dust per square foot. A micron is about 1/100th of the width of a human hair. An operating room can't have more than 20,000 microns per square foot. A clean room can't have more than 1. And Arpanet was the social equivalent of a clean room. At its peak, it had just under 600 users, all of whom either knew each other in person or were just 2 or 3 degrees of separation away from that. One of the influential characters on Arpanet was John Postel, a guy who, just by looking at him, you can tell that he kept a monster manual and a Crown Royal bag filled with dice on him at all times. Like, you can smell this picture. It smells like incense and cats. This is the guy you call if you really need to know what planet Chewbacca is from, and also 10 grams of magic mushrooms. In November of '75, Postal was denied entry onto a US Air Force plane unless he took off his sandals, which he wore year-round, and put on some shoes. That's who was on Arpanet. Academics like Postal and people in the military like the ones who wouldn't let him on that plane. Both groups came from worlds with formally established codes of conduct, and so when they designed Arpanet and the systems that would shape the internet, they did so with some wildly optimistic assumptions about how people would act. Postal himself was one of the lead people involved in designing the messaging system that would become email. He wasn't particularly concerned with the potential problem of junk mail, since to him, the issue would be easily solved by social etiquette, saying that when sending emails, people should, quote, be conservative in their sending behavior and liberal in their receiving behavior. That is, avoid sending anything unless it's important, and read any messages you get because it must, after all, be important. While this is wildly optimistic in hindsight, this utopian view of Arpanet speaks to the ideas it was founded on. Compared to Sage, which was made at the peak of the Cold War and literally designed to be run out of a nuclear bunker, all of its protocols were then written with containment and security in mind. Arpanet was instead meant to connect the world, and so was founded on ideas of trust. And for the most part, it worked. Aside from an ad for a computer company that was sent out to all 593 Arpanet users in May of 1974, which, while a big deal at the time, is kinda hilariously quaint by current standards. Also, while they tried to send the ad to every user, they weren't actually able to, since the email prototype they were using had a character limit in the address line, and so most of the addresses that they tried to enter wound up spilling over into the body of the email instead. But the first real instances of spam didn't happen on Arpanet. Instead, they were sent out on Arpanet's scrappy cousin, Usenet. Usenet, which unlike Arpanet is still around today, started as an underground knockoff. Computer science students who wanted onto Arpanet but attended schools that weren't able to buy top-of-the-line IBM computers or land a defense contract took matters into their own hands. They'd use their school's computer labs to make their own servers and modems. To cover the outrageous long-distance charges they would rack up, they'd also have to find a way to sneak their phone bill into the school's budget as an unnamed expense. This pirate internet was basically a bunch of bulletin boards called newsgroups that people could subscribe to, or more often subscribe to a larger board that would curate a selection of the mod's favorite smaller newsgroups. When you logged on, your computer would download everything that was posted to every group you were following. What this meant was that it cost next to nothing to upload something, but downloading it took precious storage space, used communal bandwidth, and increased the risk that your school would catch on to what you were doing. This made people extremely hostile to anyone who was seen as posting things that were a waste of time or just weren't where they belonged. One incident that became infamous was an Australian person who got ridiculously mad when they opened Usenet to see a classified ad for someone in Seattle selling their dresser. But this was all managed by the community. Since everyone had built their own internet connections from scratch, they understood the costs and risks. Not only that, but to be able to hide their phone bill, they needed to be pretty connected in their school. This meant that when someone misbehaved, people could always resort to looking up their school, finding their system admin, and getting them to either talk to the person or just kick them off the network. Then, in May of 1988, things changed. Over the course of about a week, a user going by the name JJ cross-posted the same message onto every news group he could. Every topic from video games to coding to music to dating advice. The message read,
"Hi, I just finished my junior year in college and now I'm faced with a major problem. I can't afford to pay for my senior year. So, as you can see, I've got a major problem, but as far as I can see, there is only one solution: to go forward. I've come a long way, and there is no chance in hell that I'm going to drop out now. I'm not a quitter, and I'm not going to give up. But here is why I'm telling you all this. I want to ask a favor of everyone out here on the net. If each of you would just send me a $1 bill, I will be able to finish college and go on with my life. I'm sure $1 is not much to any of you, but just think how it could change a person's life. I'd really like to encourage all of you to help me out. I've got no other place to go, no other doors to knock on. I'm counting on all of you to help me. Please! If you would like to help a poor boy out, please send $1. You can of course send more if you want. P.S. Please don't flame me for posting this to so many news groups. I really am in dire need of help, and if any of you were as desperate as I am, you might just resort to the same thing I am. Also, please don't tell me to get a job. I already have one and work over 25 hours a week, plus get in all my classes, plus find time to study. So hey, please consider it. It would really mean a lot to me. Thank you.
So bear in mind that before this, the biggest controversy had been over what should be done because someone saw a classified ad for a city they weren't in. Like, people were furious about that, and it was an accident. This guy JJ had plastered the most obvious dumb guy scam on every board he could, and now Usenet was out for his blood. But what makes this story significant is that after they flamed the fuck out of JJ, the next step was, of course, to contact his school's system admin, except instead of a school, his address pointed to a site called Portal.com, a private company that was selling access to Usenet. This raised some difficult questions. Who does this company have a responsibility to? The social etiquette of Usenet or their paying customer? Ultimately though, in this case, it didn't matter. Portal had system admins just like any comp sci program, and if there was one thing the people on Usenet knew, it was how to make a system admin's life miserable. They targeted Portal's sites with DDoS attacks and flooded their sysadmins' mailboxes with complaints, which at the time when you received mail and your inbox was full, it would just automatically delete your oldest message to make room. It wasn't long before Portal caved in the most fucked up way possible. They made this post.
We have received a number of inquiries about JJ. If you view these questions as the burning issues of our time, you might wish to call JJ yourself. You can reach him as Rob Noha, aka JJ, 428-488-2297.
Man, when people talk about how great the old internet was, they don't often mention how your ISP would sometimes just dox you. Also, while that dox is over 30 years old now, I changed the numbers there just to be safe. Like, come on, Rob suffered enough. All he did was invent the first ever GoFundMe campaign. Anyways, with his real name and phone number, the people of Usenet did something that I'm sure everyone remotely online is very familiar with. A good old-fashioned internet harassment campaign. Or as they called it back then, this cool new thing called an internet harassment campaign. They were able to use the information that Portal had given them to find his license plate, which also gave them the city that he lived in and the make and model of his car. They then sent people who lived near there to drive around at night until they found his car, and with it, where he lived. Now, while that is scary as fuck, and I'm not trying to downplay that kind of harassment, it's important to note, for reasons that we'll get to soon, that none of this ever turned violent. They called him at all hours of the night, ordered pizzas to his apartment, and it goes without saying, hounded him very aggressively online. Ultimately, Robert Noah issued an apology, and the harassment eventually died out. Spam had been defeated once and for all. Thanks for watching. Just imagine if that's how the video ended. No, as you know, that's not what happened. Not only was this not the end of spam, it wasn't even the beginning. While I'd argue that spam began properly 6 years later, there were some honorable mentions in those intervening years. One was the Cowabunga attack, when the word Cowabunga was posted non-stop on a bunch of news groups. Another was a guy who posted an essay about the Armenian genocide on any group that mentioned the word Turkey. Thanksgiving conversations got heavy. But for spam to really start in earnest, some changes had to happen. First was the creation of Mosaic, the first ever web browser in 1993, as well as the founding of W3C. Next was a change in Usenet's user base. So, in March 1994, AOL, who'd previously only provided access to their proprietary walled garden network, enabled their Usenet feature, giving their very not internet-savvy clients access to Usenet with just zero indication that this was something that existed for over a decade and wasn't just an AOL product. Now, all the carefully negotiated rules and etiquette that governed the network were completely out the window as people who were very unfamiliar with computers flooded into Usenet. Then, there was the privatization of the internet. While Arpanet was decommissioned in 1990, 2 years earlier, the National Science Foundation, or NSF, had created its own high-speed backbone and launched NSFNet, which soon became the dominant internet. Then, on New Year's Day 1995, the US government gave up all ownership of the internet. To celebrate, NSFNet immediately ended all bans on commercial activity on the network. The internet was officially open for business. Finally, in the early 90s, as a response to criticism over a lack of diversity in immigration, the US government started the Green Card Lottery. A lottery system where anyone could apply and be entered for a chance to get a green card, which, kind of an asshole way to respond to that criticism, right? Hey, people are saying that you barely accept any racial minorities. Fine. We'll choose some completely at random. You happy now? I mean, no? The way the lottery worked was that anyone could mail a postcard to a certain address with specific information and be entered to win permanent residency in America. Or, if an immigration lawyer had lied to you, then you could just pay them an exorbitant fee and they'll do that for you. And that's exactly the business that the law firm Cantor & Siegel was in. Made up of the husband and wife team, Lawrence Cantor and Martha Siegel. I just love it when two terrible people find each other, you know? Cantor was apparently a regular on Usenet, and so decided that the perfect place to advertise their scam was on the web. They hired a programmer to write a script which posted the following message to every news group on Usenet.
Green Card Lottery 1994 may be the last one.
The deadline has been announced. The time to start is now.
Here's how Cantor described running the script.
I remember executing this script. I think it was towards the evening when we were doing it, and just watching it run through its cycle. It took maybe an hour or two to post to all the existing news groups at the time, and when it was done, I remember just kind of wondering, what was gonna happen next?
At first, people were confused. Surely this was some kind of glitch or a mistake, right? But once they realized what had happened, they were very, very angry. A couple of things to keep in mind here. Unlike Noah's post, they didn't cross-post this. While still annoying, when someone cross-posted something, a filter would remove any duplicates, so everyone only saw it once. These were all unique posts, so everyone got them over and over and over again. Also, remember, with Usenet, the cost is much higher to download something than to upload it. All of the recipients had to pay for this spam, both financially as well as in hard drive space and bandwidth, which was a communal resource shared by everyone on the network. Also, this wasn't just the word cowabunga over and over again, or even some dumbass asking everyone for $1. This was a scam meant to take a lot of money from some very vulnerable people. And finally, maybe most frustratingly of all, unlike Noah, who hid behind an alias and asked people to mail money to a P.O. box, Cantor and Siegel were shameless. They included their real names, their website, email, phone, fax, and physical address. They wanted attention, and they got it. So before running the script, Cantor and Siegel spoke to their ISP, Internet Direct, to warn them that they might experience heavier than usual traffic, both from all the messages that they were about to send, as well as all the hate they were expecting to receive. Their ISP told them, "Not a problem. Our servers can handle anything you can throw at them, and thank you for choosing Internet Direct." The fine people of Usenet launched a massive DDoS attack targeting not only Cantor and Siegel, but Internet Direct, all of whose sites and email services were knocked out within 24 hours, soon driving the company into bankruptcy. And that was just an appetizer. After that, they set their sights on the main course. Each and every one of Internet Direct's now recently unemployed system admins. As for Cantor and Siegel, obviously their site and email were knocked down almost immediately. Cantor estimated that there were between 25,000 and 50,000 emails that never got to them. From there, people began sending them physical hate mail, faxing them non-stop, specifically sending black construction paper to waste their ink and burn out their printers. People found what appeared to be Cantor's private email and tried to use it to hack into his computer and brick it. Meanwhile, every phone number associated with them, both professional and private, was ringing off the hook 24/7 with calls from circuit-bending noise musicians. The message was very clear. Do not fuck with us. Soon, Cantor and Siegel had to release a statement, bragging that they'd received thousands of positive responses and over $100,000 in new business. They started making media appearances, presenting themselves as champions of free speech, under attack by an internet mob of weird nerds who were trying to gatekeep and censor them. While Usenet made prank calls, Martha Siegel said this to the New York Times.
Freedom of speech has become a cause for us. I continue to be personally appalled at the disrespect for freedom of speech by this handful of individuals who would take over the net if they could. The wide-eyed zealots who view the internet as their home, they have a very exaggerated sense of importance of the Usenet in their lives that the average person doesn't share.
Even more unsettling is what Lawrence Cantor told a group of businessmen.
Cyberspace needs you. Like the Old West with which analogies are often drawn, cyberspace is going to take some taming before it is a completely fit place for people like you and me to spend time.
When he calls the internet the Old West here, he means that in the colonial sense. For Cantor and his colleagues, the internet was the new world, and since the natives on the land didn't understand private property, it was their right and duty to take it from them. Now, there was some justice in all of this. Cantor was disbarred in no small part because of this scam, but the damage was done. Cantor and Siegel had shown that while harassment and prank calls might work against random assholes, they were no match against the corporate interests who were coming to the internet. From then on, it would be common to see disclaimers like this all over Usenet.
No commercial advertising, if you please. Imagine what this vulnerable medium would look like if hundreds of thousands of merchants like you put up their free ads like yours.
Yeah, somehow I find it very easy to imagine an internet cluttered up with ads. But the message was clear. Don't fuck with us. Pretty please? Let's fast forward 6 years now to 2000, when spam had become big business. Although this era only lasted a few years, it was the golden age of spam. This is the time of dick pills, MLMs, hot singles in your area, and Nigerian princes. All the stuff you probably imagine when you think of spam. At this time, spammers could be divided along two axes, forming a political compass of spam. We'll make the x-axis legitimate to illegitimate, and the y-axis working for yourself or working for other people. To give you a sense of the business, let's look at two people in opposite corners of the compass. Over here in legitimate and for hire, we have Laura Betterly, a mom who quit her accounting job to work from home in the exciting and profitable world of bulk email advertising. Betterly claims to have never worked with any scams or morally questionable businesses and was very transparent about her rates. $1,000 for the first million emails with deals available at larger volumes, and additional charges if you want the leads that her emails generated. She was also outspoken about the harassment she received from anti-spam groups who'd been sprouting up ever since Cantor and Siegel, calling them
hate groups that are trying to shut down commercial email.
Obviously a very legitimate and good industry, which she claimed,
this is what America was built on. Small business owners have a right to direct marketing.
Brave stuff. In the other corner of spam, we have someone who is marketing things that were illegitimate for himself. Davis Hawk, a neo-Nazi and owner of the companies Quicksilver Enterprises and, this is real, Amazing Internet Products. Yeah, I don't like his politics much, but his products do sound amazing. All this was to finance his weird Nazi survivalist trips into the wilderness somewhere in Vermont near the US-Canada border. Betterly is actually still around teaching classes in marketing and SEO in Florida to this very day. Hawk, on the other hand, has gone off the grid, believed to be hiding in Thailand. This is after AOL sued him and was awarded $12.8 million. They are currently fighting for the right to dig up his family's land in search of the precious metals he buried there. But now, let's look at another type of spam in the same quadrant as Hawk. Just as shady, but significantly less independent. This is probably the most iconic type of spam. My friends, I'm sure you know the situation in Africa. The Nigerian print scam, also called a 419, named after the section of the Nigerian criminal code that deals with fraud, is one of the oldest scams there is, originally known as the Spanish prisoner. As Finn Brunton describes in his book, Spam, A Shadow History of the Internet,
in brief, there is a beautiful, rich woman incarcerated by the cruel king of Spain for complex political reasons. You have been contacted because you could help her escape. In return for this, she will give you some part of her fortune, and possibly more. The escape is complex. There need to be bribes for the guards, hired guides and supplies for the trek through the mountains, help for the inside man. You receive pleading notes from her, smuggled out, and letters of credit that will make you wealthy once she and her assets have been reunited. Things do not go smoothly, because Spain is a far-off foreign country in turmoil, politically confusing and corrupt. The official documents are procured, as are the seals and letters of transit, but there's a change of authorities and a new set of bribes is needed. The muleteers have to be paid off. Negotiations have broken down. The prisoner has fallen desperately ill and needs a doctor, which the prison won't provide. But you can help. If you are out of money, could you borrow some? Why lose your savings for the cost of a little additional investment?
While the specifics are constantly changing to whichever location the scammer thinks will seem plausible to the victim, the general structure of the scam is always the same. As an article in the New York Times wrote,
Havana used to be a favorite place, but it's not used now, probably because communication with it is so frequent and easy. The letter is written as fairly well-educated foreigners speak English, with a word misspelled here and there, and an occasional foreign idiom. The writer is always in jail because of some political offense. He always has some large sum of money hid.
To give you a sense of how old this is, the title of the article that was from was An Old Swindle Revived, the Spanish Prisoner and the Buried Treasure Bait, again being offered to unwary Americans. It was written in 1898. When it comes to modern-day 419s, for anyone who's received one, well, you probably weren't in correspondence with an actual Nigerian prince. For a time at least, there was a decent chance that the email was really coming from someone in Nigeria, but probably not even the person who was actually running the scam. The initial messages are mostly written by young people on old computers in an internet cafe somewhere in the global south. These kids live in countries with very little class mobility, and so while they're well off enough to know English and have computer literacy, the best jobs they can find are often just writing phishing emails. Templates are circulated, which they update with details from the news and add their own little twists. Thanks to them, the Spanish prisoner has probably become the most told story, at least in the 21st century. The anthropologist Daniel Jordan Smith interviewed one of these low-level writers who said, quote, "How much do I really get from this anyway? The people getting rich from this are the same people at the top who are stealing our money. I'm just a struggle man." So, who are these people getting rich? Well, once one of these phishing emails gets a bite, the writers send the victim up the chain to their boss, usually someone from the white-collar professional class with the skills and resources to make the scam convincing. They'll spend some of their own money to make themselves seem legit and provide documents on stolen or forged embassy letterhead from whichever country the phisher claimed to be from, as well as bank papers proving how much money the mark will receive if they send just one more payment. But let's take a break from 419s for a second to talk about Spam the food. Spam is a canned meat made of a combination of ham and pork shoulder, along with added salt, water, modified cornstarch as a binding agent, and sodium nitrate as a preservative. It was originally made by the Hormel Food Corporation in 1937 and didn't sell very well, but surged in popularity during World War II, where it was an elegant solution to the problem of getting meat to the front lines, becoming a staple ration for the Allies and continued on as a part of US soldiers' diets well past then. Spam isn't particularly well liked and is generally considered pretty trashy in most of America. Personally, while I don't think it's that bad, especially when it's sliced and fried, it's very salty and has a bit of a weird texture. I wouldn't say it's gross by any means, but I would definitely categorize it as kind of a struggle meal. It is, however, extremely popular and in fact a status symbol in places like South Korea, Vietnam, the Philippines, Japan, Guam, and Hawaii. And what do all of those places have in common, specifically in terms of their history with the US military? In a very similar way, internet spam has a strong association with countries in the global south. From 419s to Indian technical support scams, these cons and the people who commit them are almost universally imagined to be set in the global south. In fact, one of the words that the first ever spam filter used to detect spam was republic. And while I want to be clear, scamming people is an unambiguously bad thing to do, but the geopolitical context makes this, in my opinion, a bit more complicated than just bad people being evil. Something Smith points out is how 419s rely on a certain amount of cynicism to work. Like, a lot of governments, particularly in poorer countries, are very corrupt. Lots of those countries also do have staggering income inequality and obscenely rich industrialists and aristocrats who do pay to move their money offshore for all sorts of reasons. That said, there is also something kind of funny about the types of people who fall for these, who need to be aware of all of that, while also being heartbreakingly naive in a way that's kind of touching. Like, it's one thing to be aware that an oil billionaire in Afghanistan would try to move their money overseas when the US pulled out. It's another to think that instead of them, like, having a guy for that, they'd cold call you asking for help. Or also just thinking that when you get the money, your government would be completely cool with that. Like, you're receiving an anonymous wire transfer for 100 billion Leon and don't think the FBI and IRS are gonna have any questions? But way more striking is the scammer, who's using the way their own country is very fucked up to get money from Westerners, basically exploiting their own exploitation. These scammers communicate to us in a way that's very conscious of what we in the global north expect from them, using what W.E.B. Du Bois called double consciousness, the obligation for a marginalized group to see themselves through the stereotype perception of the dominant group. Jenna Burrell writes about this in her study on internet scammers in Accra. One scam that's extremely popular in Ghana and much less shitty than 419s is the practice of making internet pen pals with people in the global north, ostensibly for friendship, romance, or mentorship, but actually with the goal of asking them for money. Burrell writes about how these people in Ghana construct stories based on what they know the Westerners are expecting to hear, exploiting the stereotype of Africa as being a continent made up entirely of people in poverty. It's a lot easier for them to tell their pen pals that they need money because a warlord burned down their local orphanage than the truth that they need the money to pay for night classes or get an apartment. And the sad thing too is what this has done to Nigeria's reputation, making it synonymous with spam and leading outside investors to be hesitant to do business in the country. And the thing is, there is a lot of fraud in Nigeria, but the victims aren't Westerners, they're Nigerians. This happens on the small scale with things like crooked cops charging illegal tolls, and on the much larger scale with Shell Gasoline, who, in an internal wire obtained by WikiLeaks, bragged about having infiltrated every level of Nigeria's government. To end this section off, It's pretty hard to get info on how often these scams succeed, in part because of the shame of having fallen for one, but also because the victims are convinced that they're giving money to do something illegal, and so rarely turn to the authorities. One amazing exception to this, though, was a businessman named James Adler, who, in 2000, realized that the guy he'd been talking to for years and given a total of $5.6 million to wasn't actually in the Nigerian government, wasn't in the process of stealing a fortune in public funds, and certainly wasn't going to repay Adler, let alone cut him in for the 40% he had promised him. Come on, who did Adler think he was? Shell gasoline? And so, realizing he'd been had, Adler did the only rational thing and filed a lawsuit against everyone who he felt had wronged him, including the government of Nigeria. I'm guessing this is also after he tried to sue the country of Africa. Also, just imagine what it'd be like just to walk down the street or go to a party if you had enough confidence to tell a foreign government that they need to pay up and get their act together because you weren't able to embezzle funds from them. Just like, I was lied to in writing that we'd be destroying this country together. You guys must have a law against that, right? They're just like, yeah, we do, but not the law you're thinking of. Now, as I mentioned earlier, throughout the golden age of spam in the late 90s and early 2000s, while spam had become a big and sometimes legitimate business, there were ever-growing groups of anti-spammers trying to take it down. One group that had begun on Usenet following Cantor and Siegel gathered in the news group news.admin.netabuse.email, or NANE for short. NANE? NANE, can I have a hard caramel? I need to sleep more. These were regular people who were just pissed off that their inboxes were full of spam and decided to spend their free time getting back at the spammers however they could. This basically just meant angry emails or phone and fax bombs whenever possible.
I'm your worst nightmare. I have a 3-line phone and nothing at all to do with my time.
We know from leaked internal emails that for the spammers, this was more of a minor annoyance than anything else. They'd usually just put the person on a list of people not to contact again and at worst get a new phone or email address. The weird thing to me though is how the spammers talked about these anti-spam activists, or as they called them, antis.
Looks like I had a zealous little anti last night. Poor loser.
Boy, some people got a lot of time on their hands. Tell the antis to get a life.
Just saying that to your coworker and then sending out 3 million emails for an MLM before lunch. Like, it's one thing to have a job that you know only makes the world worse, but it's another to look down that much on the people trying to stop you. Like, between the person who's promoting scam dick pills and the person who just doesn't want to hear about scam dick pills, the promoter is clearly the loser. But while some antis focused on vigilante justice, others tried a legal approach by working to get spam outlawed. There were a few problems with this though. One was metaphors. How would you explain spam to someone who's never used the internet? What is it like? Is it like telemarketing? I mean, kinda, but also, when you get a call from a telemarketer, you're under no obligation to take that call. You could just let it ring or hang up on them. Spam goes to your inbox just like any legitimate message, though. What about junk mail then? Better, but mailing physical letters costs money. The metaphor of junk flyers just doesn't capture the scale properly. One metaphor that anti-spam activists actually tried to use was a convention where someone had hired people to show up and run into every room shouting something about hot singles in your area or whatever. The activists argued that their goal was to get a law passed that would, in this metaphor, lock the doors so the spammers couldn't get in. But that makes it sound like they're trying to wall off the internet. Not really beating those anti-free speech allegations there. And I know this may sound pedantic, but the metaphors we use for a technology can ripple out and have huge impacts. For example, the computer scientist Alan Solomon has argued that it was a mistake to call computer viruses viruses. He argues that the general public would be better equipped to deal with them if we called them weeds, since that would lead people to think of computers like gardens that you have to prune and tend to. One solution that seemed pretty elegant was to amend the already existing laws against junk faxes to include spam. This solved a lot of the problems with other metaphors and captures the issue of a recipient being forced to pay for an unsolicited message. Not to mention the fact that lots of spammers were also sending out junk faxes. There were some problems with this, though. One was that, on a practical level, this would be really hard to enforce. Some spammers could be easily stopped with this, but what about someone like Davis Hawk? Are we seriously expecting the FCC to hike into the middle of the forest to track down a heavily armed neo-Nazi just to bring him into small claims court? And can that please be a reality show? Also, unironically, what about free speech? A link to a sketchy porn site isn't exactly the same as the banning of Ulysses, but where's the line and who gets to decide what's on one side or the other? The bill would try to ban any unsolicited or automated emails with a commercial intent, but while that describes most spam emails, it also describes a lot of things that are perfectly fine or even good. What counts as unsolicited? If a friend forwards me an email for a sale at a store I like, could that count as spam? What counts as automated? If a colleague had an automated email signature with their contact information, could I drag them to small claims court if I wanted to? Ultimately, the bill went after the content of spam, but ignored the much bigger problem of the quantity. There were a bunch of failed bills like this, but ultimately, in 2003, and not without a significant amount of lobbying from big spam companies, CAN-SPAM was passed in the USA. First problem was the name. Shouldn't it be called Can't Spam? The law put 3 restrictions on spam emails. The address they were sent from had to be a legitimate email address tied to the sender, the subject line had to make it clear that the email was an ad, and there had to be a way to unsubscribe from the mailing list. This was a very vote with your dollar solution, which is to say, bullshit. The logic was that if you sent someone spam, they would opt out, thus losing you a customer. For one thing, this completely ignores the way spammers actually function. Like, prior to CAN-SPAM, ISPs were already cracking down, and so spammers would already have to do things like sign up for a free trial with an ISP and then send as many emails as they could before getting shut down. Getting one new email address per campaign was nothing. Also, people have been able to block messages since Arpanet. The problem, in addition to spammers being able to get around it, is that blocking or unsubscribing puts the responsibility on the receiver when it should be on the sender. Finally, and this is where you really see the full influence of the spam lobby, CAN-SPAM legitimized spam. Before this law, no matter how above board people like Laura Betterly behaved, they were still in a bit of a gray area since, at the end of the day, they were in the same business as Davis Hawk. After CAN-SPAM passed, though, as long as you followed the rules, you were a perfectly legitimate business, and that could open the door to all sorts of sketchy stuff. For example, before this, ISPs would cancel the accounts of spammers. Now, not only would they not have to do that, what was stopping them from, say, making a quick buck by selling the email addresses of all of their customers? This idea of legitimate spam was particularly offensive to a man named Paul Graham. Graham was a programmer who gained prominence in the dot-com boom. He was also a bit of a hacker, and most importantly for us, he fucking hated spam. His solution was to get rid of the category of legitimate spam, and then the authorities could handle whoever was left. The first half of that plan succeeded. The second did not. You see, Graham wasn't interested in prank calls or legislation, but instead went looking for a technical solution. He realized that where other people had gone wrong was in trying to eliminate spam at the source instead of just preventing it from reaching the end user. he manually analyzed an absurd amount of spam, which you get the sense kind of broke him. He published all of his work in a blog post called A Plan for Spam, and in it, he writes this.
One great advantage of the statistical approach is that you don't have to read so many spams. Over the past 6 months, I've read literally thousands of spams, and it really is kind of demoralizing. Norbert Weiner said, "If you compete with slaves, you become a slave." And there is something similarly degrading about competing with spammers. To recognize individual spam features, you have to try to get into the mind of the spammer. And frankly, I want to spend as little time inside the minds of spammers as possible.
But by going through all that spam, he realized that while spammers could disguise their metadata or hide behind phished email addresses, the one thing they couldn't hide was their writing style. The filter Graham invented relied on something called Bayesian logic. Basically, to use a simple example, imagine someone asked you if the sun will rise tomorrow. Happens to all of us every day. And you don't know if it will or not because no one does. So to figure it out, you start by saying it's 50-50, either it will or it won't. And so you get out a bag and you put a white marble and a black marble in it. Then every day, if the sun rises, you add a white marble, and if it doesn't, you add a black one. You do that enough times, and then when someone asks you if the sun will rise, all you have to do is reach into the bag and pull out a marble. But this isn't just a simple life hack, though. This process can be used to make all sorts of complex statistical models, extending to the point where each marble is itself a bag of marbles. Given enough practice, Graham's filter was able to learn to detect which words appeared almost exclusively in spam. Words like madame, sexy, guarantee, and as I mentioned earlier, republic. As well as which words almost only appeared in real messages. Words like though, tonight, and apparently. Best of all, for his plan to work, Graham's filter didn't need to catch all spam. It just needed to catch enough to reduce spammers' profit margins to the point where they could no longer remain in business. Also, remember those CAN spam regulations? While the filter didn't catch all spam, it was amazing at catching the standard language needed for an email to comply with CAN spam, which completely put an end to legal junk mail, and with it, the golden age of spam. Except, let's come back to that quote from A Plan for Spam, specifically that line by the mathematician Norbert Weiner. The line Graham referenced first appeared in Weiner's book Cybernetics, in which he coined that term as we know it today. In its original context, it's about Weiner's fears around computer and machine automation.
Automation and cybernetic efficiencies gives the human race a new and most effective collection of mechanical slaves to perform its labor. Such mechanical labor has most of the economic properties of slave labor, although, unlike slave labor, it does not involve the direct demoralizing effects of human cruelty. However, any labor that accepts the conditions of competition with slave labor accepts the conditions of slave labor and is essentially slave labor. The key word of this statement is competition.
Essentially, even if a society doesn't use slave labor, if there's another society that does, then the only way to compete with them will be to use what amounts to slave labor. And Weiner feared that the same would be true with machine automation. It's oddly perfect that Graham used that quote as a throwaway line, since in a paper where he insists that this will end spam, that quote perfectly explains why it won't. You see, Graham's mistake was that he got that quote backwards. It wasn't him that was competing with the spammers and becoming like them. It was the spammers who were competing with his machine. And so began the third age of spam. Inspired by Graham's work, Bayesian filters became widely adopted, which, as he predicted, effectively eliminated spam as he knew it overnight. But then, something weird started to happen. People started to get spam again, but a different kind. Instead of 419s, people started to get messages like this.
Took her last look at the phantom in the glass, only the year before. However, there had been stems at China Roscoe by a box of beetle. Dearest of the larger carnivorous dinosaurs would meet, it will be handy. Does it feel better now?
Or like this.
Rosalie Pixie Sir.Chalet, healer partly. Fan leaky Aviva.guests.
So what you just heard is called lit spam, messages that are computer generated from works in the public domain. Before I explain why that exists, there's something you have to understand about spam filters. The measure of how good a filter isn't how much spam it catches, but how few real messages it mistakes for spam. People will put up with a lot of junk mail if it means that an important work email doesn't wind up in the trash. Once any messages written by a human spammer were getting caught by a filter, spammers started sending computer-generated ones that definitely wouldn't. These served two purposes. One was that these messages would generally include one sentence that actually made sense, telling the reader to click on a link, which they would often do just to figure out what was going on. But the other purpose was to put more savvy people in a catch-22. See, if they just deleted the message without labeling it as spam, then more would keep coming. But if they sent it to the junk folder, it would confuse the algorithm, causing false positives. Either the spam keeps flowing, or say goodbye to the word tonight. That wasn't the end of it, though. In A Plan for Spam, Graham laid out his theory for the end of spam. First, his filters would catch a ton of it, particularly any legitimate spam. Then, he pointed out that spammers didn't actually make that much on the sales that they did, and so any cut in their profit would be devastating. Finally, the spammers wouldn't be able to send in higher bulk to compensate since they were already operating at capacity. Here's how things played out. First of all, Graham was right that his filters would catch any legitimate spam. The problem was that it only caught legitimate spam. He was right again that it would force spammers into illegal activity, but that's where things went off the rails. First of all, once spammers moved away from dick pills, their emails could get a lot sneakier. This expanded the pool of people they could trick. There are lots of people who would see right through an MLM, but would be fooled by, say, a fake email from PayPal. This also fixes the problem of profit margins. It's absolutely true that they couldn't make ends meet anymore by selling porn, but instead of throwing in the towel, they pivoted to things like identity theft. And finally, while spammers may have been operating at capacity using American ISPs, there's a whole big world out there filled with sketchy ISPs who aren't bound by US laws. What's more, if the spammers are already doing cyber crimes, then hey, what's a couple botnets between friends? Paul's plan for spam succeeded in doing exactly what it set out to do, put an end to legitimate spam. But by doing that, it let a very hungry monster out of its cage. We'll come back to email scams soon, but for now, let's check in with the rest of the internet. Around this same time, Google rose to power. To understand how Google changed the game, here's a brief overview of how search engines work. All search engines have three parts: a spider, an indexer, and a query handler. The spider goes out and finds all the items that can be searched, in this case, websites. It's a spider because it goes on the... I just got that. Once it's done searching the web, it brings everything to the indexer, which indexes everything so it can be easily found. The query handler then takes whatever someone searches for and gets it from the index. It also, depending on its complexity, does things like adding related terms, correcting spelling mistakes, or translates straight up questions into terms that the indexer can understand. Now, as any of my fellow clout sharks will know, the order that results are displayed in is extremely important, especially with web searches. First-gen search engines ranked pages based on the frequency that a search word appeared on them. In addition to just not being very good, this system was extremely vulnerable to spammers who'd add text in the same color as the page's background with just a ton of search terms, artificially raising its ranking in the search. Google's first big game changer was their PageRank algorithm. Instead of just ranking pages based on the number of times that the search term appeared, they add a measurement of how many other sites linked to that site, creating second-gen search engines. While this was a bit trickier, it didn't take long for spammers to learn to exploit this too. Link farms were created, sites with nothing but links to other sites which people could pay to be on. Now, while the folks at Google may be evil, they weren't dumb. They were able to fix this and drastically improve their search engine by adding another metric: reputation. Now the bonus that a site got from a link depended on how popular the site linking to it was. I talk about this way more in my video about surveillance capitalism, but an interesting thing to note here is that what Google did was take the emergent social phenomenon, the relationship between different websites, and folded them back into the search engine, exploiting human interactions like a natural resource. Anyways, as you can guess, this new development drastically reduced the effectiveness of link farming, and from here, it seemed like spammers were stuck. They could fake interactions between their sites, but from the view of Google's algorithm, these are incredibly easy to spot. The only way it'd be possible to fool the algorithm at this point would be to, create an entire society of spam bots. Now, at this point, I want to give a shout out to one of my favorite creators. Her name's Tara, and she runs a blog called Tyler Honored with RD Jonas E. She makes a really good point in one of her recent posts, titled Tyler State Trial Law Litigation Lawyer Attorney Robert M. In it, she writes this.
9 state regulators investigating auction bonds, group says. The City of Tyler Traffic Engineering Department installed the city. Our web servers cannot find the page or file you asked for. Best choice of the month, _blood pressure. Button to return to the previous page. Astronomers on verge of finding Earth's twin. The cost of having a product registered is now estimated to be round million. Century, the public may demand that the federal _bar board Massachusetts overseer _register products that are effective against bed bugs. My mother lives in _affect medoprolo _side housing and has been dealing with this for about a year now.
That goes on for about 13,000 more words. She writes 4 or 5 of those every day. Tara's an absolute content machine. Literally, she's a spam bot. The way she works is that someone created a Blogspot account and then coded a program to copy and paste articles with random keywords. In this case, Tyler and city. She's not alone either. In the middle of sentence fragments about Tyler Perry and municipal ordinances, she randomly links to other blogs, also run by bots. At this point, blogs like these make up the majority of the internet. And while these sites are much harder to track than link farms, Google is pretty smart, so why aren't they cracking down on them? A big part of it is that in addition to links, these blogs are completely covered in ads, which are generated by Google. I think one of the creepiest things about these spam blogs is that they are actually the ideal content creators. They post on a consistent schedule, they pay very close attention to SEO trends, and they never burn out. Now, let's talk really quickly about one of the most misunderstood concepts on the internet, the Turing test. The mathematician and computer scientist Alan Turing's famous test that he came up with in 1950 was never actually meant to be a literal test, but a thought experiment. A prominent question at the time was, can machines think? Turing thought that that was a stupid question. The point of his test was to turn it around and instead ask, can people think? Or, more specifically, can we be convinced that other people can think? The test, as Turing imagined it, would have a judge write messages to 2 people. One would be a human, the other a computer. The computer would pass the test if it could convince the judge that it was the human. While the Turing test is regularly misunderstood in science fiction, it is very real and used regularly. You may have even taken one today. The only twist is that they aren't administered by humans, but other machines. An example of this is CAPTCHA, which stands for Completely Automated Public Turing Test. While lit spam or spam blogs obviously won't work on humans, they do on machines. This is where Weiner's prediction has come true. To compete with slave labor, you need to accept slave labor. To compete with machines, you need to use machines. The majority of the internet is now a secret arms race, never meant to be seen by human eyes, where 2 factions of machines compete at the Turing test. There is also a bit of a gray area though, which is pretty interesting. For example, with CAPTCHA, spammers will buy software to crack it. These CAPTCHA crackers will generally offer a success rate of around 12 to 20%. Not bad at all. But one appropriately named program called Captcha King is the best at this, with a 90% success rate. How do they do it? Easy. Just pay people to sit at a computer and solve CAPTCHAs for you. Captcha King and similar programs like Collodi Bablo pay their staff around $3 American a day, basically just to be human. This raises some questions about where bots end and humans begin. For example, AOL, once the internet provider, now runs content farms. They actually recently bought the Huffington Post with plans to turn it into a clickbait factory. Also, sorry, for those who are unfamiliar, content farms are where people go to milk Mr. Beast. Now, the way these sites like WikiHow and now the Huffington Post work is that real writers are hired to turn out low-quality articles as fast as possible on topics picked by an algorithm. And the question then is, what's the difference between that and an editor of a traditional magazine knowing that sex sells? Hell, what about me? I have a Chrome extension called TubeBuddy that I use when I choose video topics. Whenever I search something on YouTube, the extension tells me how good of an idea it is to make a video about that topic, based on how many people are searching for it versus how many videos there already are about it. And it's definitely not like that's the only thing I think about when I choose a topic, and I've done plenty of videos that the extension told me would do terribly, but it does honestly influence my choice to some extent. Also, as I mentioned earlier, this video is sponsored, and while I don't think there's anything wrong with me doing that, it does give me pause regarding how different what I'm doing is from what a spam bot does. But let's set those questions aside for now. I'll come back to them as I lay awake in bed tonight. Instead, let's go back to the state of spam email today. One of the strangest things about spam as it exists now is that the people sending it don't even know that they're doing it. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine you're working in an office. You're in your cubicle staring at a spreadsheet while fluorescent lights beat down on you when you get an email from your coworker. The subject line says that a message failed to send. Weird. You open the email and it reads, "The message contains Unicode characters and has been sent as a binary attachment." Huh? What does that mean? You download the attachment and it opens a terminal file with a bunch of weird symbols. You close the window and email the coworker, "Something going on with your email, LOL?" And then you forget about it. Maybe you notice from then on that your computer's a little bit slower. You've just installed a piece of malware called a worm. While you get back to work on your spreadsheets, the worm is working in the background. The first thing it does is find your email and sends a version of the message you just opened to everyone in your contacts with some slight changes made to the message by randomly selecting options from a small pool. Next, it looks for file sharing software and uploads itself there, maybe as porn or cracked software. Finally, it opens an internet relay chat, or IRC, with its controller, then waits for orders. Multiply that by a few thousand, and you've got a botnet. What I just described is actually very similar to a famous worm called MyDoom. A particularly creepy thing about this worm is that embedded in its code was the following message. Generally translated to, "Andy, I'm just doing my job. Nothing personal. Sorry." Who Andy is or what that job was, no one knows, but it is creepy as fuck. Now, let's take a look at this from the other side of the IRC and put ourselves in the shoes of the people sending these out. You're a spammer in the year 2022. You've got a worm that you either made yourself or more likely bought or stole from someone else. You send it out to a couple mailing lists you find online. At first it infects 1 or 2 people, but soon it spreads to hundreds and then thousands of computers. Congratulations, you are now the proud owner of a botnet. Now what? First of all, you look through the computers in your network for usernames and passwords, as well as anything involving PayPal or credit cards. While you could then try to use those yourself, that takes time and it's risky if you don't know what you're doing. Instead, you log on to a different IRC channel that's a marketplace for scammers like you. From here, you could sell the data you collected. Banking data and passwords go for around $10 per megabyte, more if you go through and sort everything yourself. You can sell 100 good credit card numbers for $10. Maybe half of those can actually be used. The buyer will then order stuff online and sell it once it arrives. But there's lots more ways to make money here. You could send some spam for someone, 1 million messages for around $100, or charge $15 an hour for DDoS attacks. Then there's always crypto mining, or usually most profitable and the least amount of work, just selling or leasing your botnet to someone else. Now, the one thing that's unrealistic about this is that there aren't really that many small-time bot masters anymore. Spam, like every other part of the internet, has, through economies of scale, become consolidated into the hands of fewer and fewer people, to the point where now almost all spam is done by around 100 people. And that's more or less where we are now. Spam's gone from being an anomaly to a nuisance to now being the background hum of the internet. In a sense, spam is the internet working exactly as it should. No more wasted computing power while office workers stare at spreadsheets or go to lunch. What are email services supposed to do if not send emails? Not just a few a day, but millions every hour. On that same note, what is a DDoS attack if not a server being used to its full potential? I think that this is ultimately what spam does. It turns whatever it sets its sights on into something that can be exploited for its maximum economic potential. Where we would see people interacting socially as a community, it sees them as an audience that, if they're only shown enough of a message, can be made to do or buy or think what it wants us to. To be clear, spam in its current form could be fought. There are algorithms that could catch bots and ways of going after the infrastructure that they rely on. But why do that when, given the way the internet has developed, they're its ideal users? Thanks for watching.
Can't find my keys. Can't find my headphones. Can't find a reason for me to keep on. Went to the pub and chugged a beer down. My girlfriend's calling. I wonder what does she want? I wonder what does she want? Attention deficit disorder. Attention deficit disorder. Attention deficit disorder. Attention deficit disorder. On what you're saying, I need to call my dude and get my medicine. It's better than what they can get you from the doctor. My shirt is wet cause I've been sweating like a lobster. Attention deficit disorder. Attention deficit disorder. Attention deficit disorder. Attention deficit disorder. I cannot function without my amphetamine. I see you talking, but I cannot hear a thing. I'm staring out the window, thinking about the future. I hope that they replace my brain with a computer. I wonder if we're living in a simulation. Stop making noise, cause you'll go break my concentration. Attention deficit disorder. 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 Attention deficit disorder.
This video is sponsored by Surfshark VPN. Click the link in the description to get 83% off for 2 years plus 3 months for free.